there was a way you could just erase every cringy moment from your mind, would you? I'm talking about the ones that keep you up at night, like the time you accidentally called your teacher mom, or when you posted that picture with that haircut you thought looked really good at the time, or when you told the delivery driver, "You too," after they said, "Enjoy your food." Almost all of us have moments where we look back at our younger selves and cringe. And most of us cringe when we see someone else doing something we feel like they're gonna regret later. Each of us has our own definition of what is cringe, our own mechanisms to cope with cringe, and our own cringy stories. Today, I want to explore that topic by sharing some of my experiences with you and delving into the mechanics behind what makes us recoil into a human pretzel when we see something we find to be cringe. I was widowed when I was 28 years old, and up until last year, I used to make really dark jokes about that in my comedy content. My late husband, George, and I produced a comedy podcast together called The Dirty Bits of History, and before he died, we were working on stand-up sets with the goal of performing on stage together. One of the things that George and I initially had connected over was using humor to cope with life's challenges. He often made jokes about being terminally ill. It was how he coped. He used to say that laughing made him feel like he was getting a break from the excruciating pain he was in. It seemed natural that I would continue to do the same after he died, get a break from all the excruciating pain I felt when I was grieving. I transitioned our podcast into a show where I interviewed comics and mental health professionals about using comedy to cope with grief and trauma. I was also creating comedy content on various platforms about all the absurdities and what it was like being a young widow. A big reason of why I was creating content and making all this stuff was because I was trying to connect with other people who were like me, who understood what I was going through. Unlike hot singles, there didn't seem to be a ton of other young widows in my area who were wanting to connect. Another reason I was creating that content is because it felt like I was using my craft as a storyteller and entertainer to process everything, my trauma and my grief. If you've ever met a creator, or if you are one yourself, this probably sounds painfully familiar. Over the first 2 years, people reached out daily. They told me how relieved they were to hear that mental health professionals on my podcast were validating that it was okay to use humor to cope with tragedy. They were glad that it didn't mean they were a bad person. They were comforted to learn that there was no wrong way to grieve and that all of the things that they were experiencing were completely normal, and that as long as they weren't hurting themselves, there really weren't any wrong answers when it came to coping. There were also people who accused me of creating content for clout. I was called attention-seeking, and some people even speculated that I was responsible for my husband's death. I lost track of how many times I read the word cringe, which was strange to me because Patton Oswalt and Pete Davidson both made jokes about grieving their partner and father respectively, so I wasn't sure why it wasn't okay when I did it. Yeah. And yeah, it bothered me, but I was also interviewing therapists and psychologists weekly about using comedy and content creation as an outlet. And they all reassured me it wasn't inherently wrong. It was actually even something they thought was healthy. Many of them even coped in the same way. Last year, I moved away from including my grief in my content. I just felt like I had handled it. I was doing okay, and I had just simply grown to the next stage of my life, which was something I was very grateful for, but not actually totally surprised by. A lot of creatives change, grow, evolve, and their work oftentimes does so right along with them. I had completed my process, and I'm really grateful that it allowed me to reach this place of healing and peace. But then, there's this account that reposts creators' content that they think is cringe, and they had shared another widow's video, a video in which she talked about her husband dying, and the comments were brutal, and I was mortified. Maybe it was cringe to make dark jokes and to even just talk about your grief. Maybe every expert and comedian I had interviewed was wrong. Oh God. Suddenly everything was cringe. I was cringe, she was cringe, makeup tutorials were cringe, food reviews were cringe, dancing was cringe, lip syncing was cringe, trends were cringe, recording yourself was cringe. Everything was cringe. I stared deep into the void that was cringe, and the cringe stared back. This video is cringe! I couldn't unsee it. And I also began to wonder, if everything was so cringe, how do I avoid being cringy? How does anyone? To do that, I would have to figure out the answer to one important question. What is it that makes something cringe? The concept of cringe isn't new. It actually comes from an Old English word, cringen. Cringen? Cringen. I don't speak Old English, unfortunately. And it basically means to yield in battle, to give way, to become bent, to curl up. It's also the root of the word crinkle, which I just thought was a fun fact. Cringen evolved into the word cringe in the 16th century and meant to bend or crouch in embarrassment, servility, or fear. And then, just before the year 1900, it took on its current connotation and was defined as recoiling embarrassment, shame, or fear. But why do certain things give us the ick while others don't? Why do we yuck what is clearly somebody else's yum? I mean, sometimes one person's cringe is just another person's reality. Turns out it's tough to define. Cringe isn't a clinical term. It's simply used to describe the fear of social rejection, a feeling which can be just as intense as physical pain. According to Tai Tashiro, who is a social scientist and the author of Awkward, The Science of Why We're Socially Awkward and Why That's Awesome, says, awkward moments are deviations from social expectations. So, if we miss even a tiny expectation, or we think we've crossed some boundary, it creates that surge of emotion. Our faces might flush, our heart rate might pound, you might start to sweat. There's that panicky feeling that you need to do something to fix the situation. Or even worse, run away entirely and hide in embarrassment. In the modern era, much of our exposure to the concept of cringe has been through comedies like The Office, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, Bridesmaids, and literally anything produced by Sacha Baron Cohen. But more recently, we've come to associate cringe with situations that aren't always professionally produced stories meant to facilitate the feeling. The situations I'm talking about are ones that are mostly found on social media platforms. Nowadays, so much of our lives are online. Many of us have highly intentional public personas, oftentimes because our occupations require it. This has led to a culture of unnatural performances and inevitable embarrassment when how we want to be perceived and how we're actually perceived are not one and the same. When we cringe, it's because we're embarrassed by the behavior we're seeing. We may be disgusted or uncomfortable by what we watch. In some instances, we're reminded of our own past behaviors and feel shame. The physical response we experience is in fact linked with our primeval selves because our bodies produce adrenaline when we're in situations we assess as threatening. It's why we get that rapid heartbeat, blush, and sweat when we're exposed to anything cringy. 2020 also did a number on our emotional and physical health. People are tired, which means there's a good chance they're feeling anxious and gloomy, which can very often crank the dial up on a person's hypervigilance. This means we could be more alert and sensitive than usual to things that make us feel judged or less than. Our past selves are preserved on our accounts, often visible to the public, which means that natural transition and growth we have as humans can be viewed at any time, for the first time. And while cringing has often been rooted in empathy and humor, I can't help but notice it's lately being used to laugh at people as opposed to with them. I was told that I was put into baby beauty pageants and modeling as an infant because I was terrified of people. The goal was to get me comfortable in social situations, kind of desensitize me, and get me a lot better at making the dreaded eye contact. As a kid, I remember feeling overwhelmed at how everything always felt so loud, bright, and just intense. I have memories of holding my hands against my ears in the car because the sound was deafening. I would have meltdowns because the seam on the toe of my sock felt like it was causing my foot actual pain. By the time I was 4, my favorite thing to do was hide in my room and devour book after book. My favorites were Matilda and Ella Enchanted. Escaping into stories made my life feel less stressful because I wasn't getting in trouble for saying or doing the wrong thing or being told how embarrassing, how cringy I was. But it was also lonely. I liked people, but I didn't understand them or understand why they didn't like me. But that all changed when I started acting on stage. Now there was a script I could memorize, and there were very defined expectations I could fulfill. I was able to imitate what I saw on TV and what the director showed me. I could memorize my lines and everyone else's for a scene the following day, and I was praised heavily for it. I made everyone happy, and that made me happy. I would watch hours of movies and TV, analyzing expressions, studying mannerisms and social cues. I filled notebooks with all the rules. And it was exhausting having to be so aware and unnatural all of the time. However, it did seem to help me as an actor. It also helped me in social situations, and it gave me a good base for working in retail in my teens and 20s. But it always seemed like once I felt like I had figured it all out, the rules would change. For example, Person A would say something I was supposed to laugh at, but Person B would find it offensive. And I wasn't sure who was right. All I knew was I didn't want to hurt anybody. Where was the answer key in the back of the book for relationships and social situations like the one in my history textbooks I loved reading so much? Social expectations were, and still often are, confusing. Since being in therapy for the last few years, I've learned what the words masking and neurodivergent mean. It's still something I'm trying to wrap my head around, as someone who grew up during a time that insisted people like me didn't have certain kinds of developmental differences. Now that it's something I'm aware of, things have started to make more sense, and I've been privileged enough to make adjustments in my life, so my days are significantly more pleasant than they've ever been. I've always found many of the dynamics we experience when we're in primary through high school exist in adulthood as well. Experimenting, being vulnerable, being different. It's still often considered cringe. People who make comments that are less than kind seem to find comfort from their own insecurities by judging others who are daring to step outside of what can safely be considered socially acceptable. I personally consider a lot of content creation to be modern folk art. It's expressive, and it's a medium that's used to connect us. I think we all love it when we see someone communicate an idea that makes us feel less alone, which is a large part of why we enjoy art. Sometimes, though, creating content makes me feel like a kid again, desperately trying to figure it all out, and hoping that I'm not painfully rejected for being too me. It's a big part of the job as an actor, rejection. And when you're rejected, it's often because you simply weren't the right fit for the part, not because you're bad at acting. 9 times out of 10, you just weren't what the casting directors were looking for. For me, it's not particularly painful simply because it's not particularly personal. So what if we applied that same kind of thinking to other areas in life when we're rejected? What if we're just not right for some particular people? And what if we're okay with that? To be cringy is to be alive. I don't know that anyone is immune from the behavior entirely. The human experience is not one that is free from uncomfortable feelings. Growth and change aren't comfortable. That's why I think some people are fearful of both and choose to remain stagnant. So what if we embraced being cringy in the same way we embrace things like horror movies and roller coasters? Both are scary experiences that give us a thrill, that break up our routines and challenge us. And when we are in control of these experiences, they can help us practice how we'll handle similar situations when we aren't in control. We can get better at managing these uncomfortable feelings during and after the cringy event. It's a similar approach to what I learned in dialectical behavior therapy. Instead of running from or suppressing a feeling, you acknowledge it, accept it, and then move forward. I've often found that when I practice avoidance, I become hypervigilant, and I experience unpleasant anxiety symptoms like stomach pain, a racing heart, shortness of breath, and, in some extreme instances, I panic. I used to find myself in a vicious cycle of avoiding and leaving situations when I felt these symptoms, which damaged my self-worth more than I'd like to admit. While I admit to being very hypervigilant even before I was widowed, it became pretty extreme after the fact. It was only after I faced those feelings head-on with the help of both comedy and community that those feelings became so much more manageable. Now I rarely have big, intense feelings at all, and I'm more stable and secure than I've been in 32 years. I'm not glad that my husband didn't live past the age of 29, and I'm not glad that bad things have happened to me. But I am grateful that I've learned to become a much more empathetic person and that my perspective is only broadening as I get older. I truly believe that just about everybody is really trying to do their best, and that gives me a lot of peace. I don't know, maybe I'm just being cringy, but that's okay. Thank you so much for watching me jump into the deep end with long-form content. If you stuck around, that really does mean the world to me. I want to do more of these kinds of videos, and I can't wait to share them with you. If that's something you're into, go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you feel like it, but no pressure. And extra special thanks to TawnyVoice.com members and Instagram subscribers: Brisky Business, Link Curie, Jordan, Randy Andrews, Dave the Process Wizard, Rogue Thor, Ethilic the Drifter, Le Phantom, last of his name, Herald of the 4-Day Workweek, Chuck, Joe, Patrick Golden, Sed, Ash, Mike Tatuli, Beowulf042, Ben, Danny Lamb, Alex, Kareem, Will F, Mir W, Jeff S, Eugene E, Greg the 99, Thod, Mark H, Bob S, Wasana H, Trenton Bennett, and Scott Bondelli Music. Thank you so much. See you next time.